up on the screen. Have we got it up on the screen yet? No, we haven't. So, okay, so the recommendation that Council, on the recommendation of the Environmental Performance Committee, review citizen science opportunities in the coastal domain prior to 2022-23 sampling season and incorporate citizen science and resourcing into appropriate LTP business cases.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to move that.
Okay, Dennis, yep, that's great. Stu's happy to second, unless, yes, that's great. Does anyone have any questions around that? Or comments? Or,
It's vague enough to, like, we'll see what comes of it. It's really just asking for.
It's asking for us to investigate it, really.
Yeah. At any point, it may go further or not. So
and it's saying that we think the coastal domain is a priority. So, you know, that's...
which I'm all for coastal domain. Yeah.
That's right.
Just a comment, I guess. Look, as I've already said to you, Kathy, but for everybody else, when you involve the coast and people participate, particularly in monitoring this activity, you actually build guardianship, kaitiaki-ness, awareness, and it involves communities to look, so that the unintended consequences of just monitoring and entering this stuff builds a whole lot of environmental well-being.
I agree.
So it's not just the fact that you're collecting this, you're actually building
I agree with you, Fred. And I actually think
I
think everybody here is in support of it. So, let's just put this recommendation. All in favour? Aye. Anyone against? No. Okay, it's carried. Thank you very much to the staff who helped us put that together. And I'm really sorry to Jonathan and Michelle. I know, Michelle, you have to go somewhere, so I'm sorry for the delays. If you'd come forward, that'd be great. Thank you. Okay, so this is on page 11. This is the PCE report, knowing what's out there, regulating the environmental fate of chemicals and what it means for council. Welcome, good to see you again. You'll need a microphone on for them to hear. Have we got a red light there? And once you've got a red light, just leave it.
All right.
Leave it on. Yeah.
Okay. So we've been asked to talk to you about the findings of this Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment's report, which is entitled "Knowing What's Out There, Regulating the Environmental Fate of Chemicals." So the preparation of the report was led or overseen by the Parliamentary Commissioner, Simon Upton, and certainly it's a really good summary of what the issues are and some good recommendations. Some of the issues that have been identified are things that Michelle and I have been aware of, well aware of, but there are some interesting findings that we weren't perhaps aware of. So we'll certainly walk you through it in as quick a way as we can. So I think if we could just move to the first slide, please. Okay, so what does the report find? So clearly the Environmental Protection Authority, the EPA, is responsible for assessing and managing environmental risk from chemicals under the HASNO Act, or Hazardous Substances and New Organisms Act. And the responsibilities include setting application rates. So, for example, for pesticide use, recommendations for the safe use of the pesticides or chemicals, and controlling how they don't or minimise how they get into the environment, and also specifying environmental exposure limits or safe threshold guidelines for the environment from the use of those chemicals. Now, only a tiny portion of chemicals that are used in New Zealand have actually been assessed, and we have very few environmental exposure limits. So there are around 150,000 substances that have been approved by the EPA for use in New Zealand. And those different substances consist of 30,000 different chemicals, and around 3,500 of those, so only a bit more than 10%, have actually been individually assessed. What's happened historically is that when the Has No Act was put together, it replaced a whole lot of other regulations where different chemical approvals were transferred across in groups. So substances that have similar properties are all brought together in one group and given the same sort of controls. And also with new substances, when people apply to bring in and import new substances and use them, they apply to the EPA and they say, we think our substance fits under this group, and then it will have these particular controls. The problem with that is that individual chemicals, some chemicals may require much more specific controls than others, so that sort of approach doesn't really individually manage the risk of some of the more toxic substances that are used, or if they are used in much higher quantities. There is also no tracking of chemicals, or no database which is kept, which logs and details the volumes of chemical use, the amounts that have been imported, the amounts that have been used in different parts of the country. How frequently are they used? Are they mainly used in summer versus winter? So we're actually one of the only countries in the OECD that doesn't do that, which is clearly a large oversight, and has been an issue that we've in Council have grappled with in the past. So some chemicals are also excluded from these controls. For example, there are naturally occurring estrogenic hormones that are excreted from cows, cattle, which end up in waterways. There are also chemicals such as zinc, which is part of facial eczema treatments that are used for cattle, which are applied to animals under the veterinary regulations, which fall under the MPI, and they don't have controls for avoiding those chemicals getting into the environment. And we do know from our monitoring that we do have a problem with zinc. Human medicines are another issue because while they are regulated under the Medicines Act and enforced by MedSafe, their role is around protection of human health, safe use of medicines. It doesn't look into what happens to those medicines after they've been metabolized and excreted through the human body and pass through into the wastewater treatment system and then end up in the environment. Another exclusion from controls is neonicotinoids when they're used as a coating on seeds. So neonicotinoids have been well known as an issue overseas with regards to their impacts on pollinators, bees. In New Zealand, if you're spraying neonicotinoids, you do have to meet certain controls, but if you've coated seeds, if you're putting out seeds that have been coated with them, they're considered a manufactured article, and the EPA doesn't consider that they need to have controls. So that was a clear issue that was raised by the Parliamentary Commissioner. It's very unclear why they've taken that approach with these seeds. If we could just move on to the next slide, please. So the report talks about the different agencies and where the issues are and where they're doing okay. Regional councils are doing a good job around managing discharges of contaminants to the environment under the RMA, where we're actually doing that under a consented process. So if there's an activity that clearly falls under the requirement for a consent, we can control and manage the fate of those chemicals into the environment. We have the ability to put in controls through consent conditions and monitoring requirements, and we're also able to recover costs for that. We also have the ability, regional councils also undertake state of environment monitoring to assess regional conditions and trends, and some of the funding for that does come through consented activities. So we do have the ability to do our state of environment monitoring. However, it was found that there is quite a lot of variation from region to region about what gets monitored and how it gets monitored, and less than 200 chemicals are regularly monitored across New Zealand. There are additional ones that are often included in different special investigations and surveys. For example, we've done some groundwater investigations that have looked into emerging contaminants. So there's definitely other chemicals that are investigated, but not on a routine state of environment basis. If we could just move to the next slide, please. Some of the things we perhaps don't do so well in is around managing the fate of chemicals through permitted activity rules. And that's not necessarily our fault. The problem here is that we do not have the ability to factor in the scale and frequency of use and toxicity. So for example, pesticides and agrochemicals, we don't have any ability to know what volumes or tons of chemicals are used in our region, how frequently they are used. So we've just got very little information to go on for some of these chemicals that are often discharged under permitted activity rules. Because we don't know how much and where they're being used, we can't tailor our environmental monitoring to look for the adverse effects, and also the ability to recover costs to do that is not available. And because we also have so few environmental exposure limits to compare results with, even if we did monitor for those chemicals, we would not know what the adverse effects might be without clear sort of thresholds to compare against. If we could just move to the next slide, please. The report also talks about other agencies, so clearly under the HASNO Act and the RMA, they are the EPA and regional councils that are principal statutory tool for managing environmental fate of chemicals. District councils also have a role in HASNO with regards the under land use consents for the safe storage and, of those chemicals. However, there are additional powers that are noted under the Health and Safety at Work Act. So WorkSafe are responsible for ensuring that workers are safely or not exposed unduly to chemical use. The trouble with WorkSafe is it tends to have had a history of focusing more on injury prevention and not so much expertise around preventing exposure to chemical use. There is the Agrochemical Compounds and Veterinary Medicines Act, which falls under the MPI. Again, these regulations don't have any ability to control or avoid the environmental fate of chemicals. Under the Medicines Act, again, medicines that are excreted by humans will end up in the environment, and there's no way under the Medicines Act to control or enforce that. The report also identifies some clear constraints on the level of priority, capability and capacity for some of these agencies to enforce the use of hazardous substances. Could just move to the next slide, please. So the report makes several recommendations, and the first one is the ability for all, or the need for all agencies to deal with chemicals under a common framework. And the common framework here is identified under 3 factors. So what is the scale of use? How much is being used? What is the harm that is posed? So the toxicity and exposure routes for chemicals, and the extent that it is detected or monitored in the environment. And Dr. Nick Kim, who used to work at this council, assisted Parliamentary Commissioner with preparing aspects of this report, and this was his contribution here with this diagram, which provides the ability to, when you intersect the 3 different factors, you can clearly see where you need to focus. Obviously, if you've got chemicals that are being detected in the environment, they're being used in a large scale and they're harmful, we need to be focusing there. But likewise, we also need to focus on some of those other areas where there may only be, say, 2 intersections. So the chemicals may be in large scale and known to be harmful, but we might not be picking them up in the environment. This might be because laboratory techniques are not available yet, or there's not enough information around guidelines. And so we need to be still keeping a handle on those other intersecting areas so that when more information comes to light or things change, we have that evidence to proceed on prioritisation in those areas. So I'll now just move on to Michelle.
Great. So I'm just taking over from Jonathan. Next slide, please. So this was definitely the main recommendation, is that there needs to be a common framework that all agencies are working collaboratively over. And these subsequent 3 recommendations really are just to support that. It's about empowering the EPA to collect that information. As you can imagine, there is a lot of perceived and real commercial sensitivities around that stuff. But it would seem that the PCE's position is that there is more benefit in actually collecting that information than withholding it. That MFE should develop guidance on environmental monitoring for the regional councils to improve that regional variability. And that, as Jonathan said, those environmental exposure limits, we need to have more of them so that we can identify when there actually is an issue. So that all supports that main recommendation of developing a common framework. Next slide, please. So for council, and this is really what we wanted to boil down for you all today, is that not all chemicals pose environmental risks. So Jonathan's absolutely right, 150,000, but not all of those deserve our attention. The trouble is that as an organisation, we don't have good information or direction on which ones we need to focus on, because we don't know how much is being used, how often they're used, where they're being used, and what their toxicity is. So because of the funding that we have, and we need to spend our funds wisely, our regional monitoring programs can only monitor a very small subset of those. And that's really the guidance that we're looking for on where to best target our resources. So our permitted activity rules are assuming that pesticides, you know, agricultural pesticides, herbicides, things like that, are being used correctly. And that therefore, if they're used in accordance with the recommendations of use and the controls that are put on those, that there shouldn't be any adverse effect on the environment. The trouble is that the PCE's report suggests that that might not be the case. Next slide, please. So what we've suggested, Jonathan and I are suggesting that council could consider, ultimately there needs to be leadership from the top. So that main recommendation of developing a common framework for all agencies to form under really needs to come up from central government. So one of the things we're suggesting is that this council could be an advocate for that, to ensure that this report doesn't just languish in somebody else's filing cabinet, that there is action and expectation that actions will be taken as a result of it. We have suggested that potentially the Strategy and Policy Committee could consider looking at a project that focuses on a systematic approach to monitoring the impacts of permitted activity rules. So that might be the application of pesticides and herbicides that are currently under permitted activity rules. And somewhat related to that, it doesn't necessarily have to be done in isolation by the Waikato Regional Council. It could be something that we form a partnership on or a collaboration on with external agencies. And that's where that third one comes in too, is for chemicals that fall outside of HASNO, there does seem to be a need to look into those more carefully, and that's where council could advocate for collaboration and research. I think that's the last slide, so hopefully there is some time for, thank you, Chair.
I just had one question, and that was, so just in relation to your recommendation number 3, which is around the Strategy and Policy Committee investigating the scoping of a regional policy review project focused on developing a systematic and auditable approach to monitoring the impacts of chemicals covered by permitted activity rules. So I just wondered, you know, when you were talking about exceptions and, you know, there are an awful lot of exceptions to things. I mean, yeah, I mean, when you look at that, 150,000 chemicals, less than 200 regularly monitored. I mean, in practice, the environmental exposure limit is really set, etc. I mean, it kind of feels a bit ridiculous to me. But I'm glad that there is somebody has actually had a look at it. But my question is around the permitted activity rules. So, for instance, 1080 is one of the most widely used across the country. It's an aerially spread toxin. It's dropped into streams. So there are pathways there for harm, but it used to be the subject of a regional council consent, but it no longer is. There's an exemption for 1080, brodifacoum and rotenone, and that came in 2017, so that nobody has to apply for a consent. They just basically consent themselves. So I guess My question is around permitted, what the definition of permitted activity rules would include. Would it actually include something like 1080, which is a widely spread toxin, and at the moment, council itself isn't doing any of that
I suppose it's
monitoring?
more difficult when central government is you know, there is that requirement that, but we do have the ability for other herbicides, pesticides, to put in more controls under our regional plan rules. EPA and under Has No Act does tend to sort of discourage putting in additional controls that they think are already acceptable or have been assessed under the Has No Act, but regional plan rules, you know, can look at, and it might still be a permitted activity rule, but better controls or better conditions under regional permitted activity rules around pesticide use, agrochemicals.
I suppose what I'm just asking is that particular recommendation there, when you're specifying permitted activity rules, does that include things for which exemptions have been granted or not?
Well, we hadn't looked into that yet. That's probably part of that scoping.
Yeah.
I would imagine would need to look into. Yeah.
And that would
what
have to
ability
be
that could be done.
prioritised too.
Yeah.
So what we would be looking at is that Venn diagram with the perfect storm of toxicity, volume of use and frequency of
Yeah.
use. So it might be that mammalian pesticides might not be as high a priority as some of the plant pesticides that also impact our pollinators,
Yeah.
for example. So that would have to come out in the wash of something like that. And that's why our first recommendation is there. Let's
That it
start
needs
from
to
the
start
top
with
and
national.
start gathering that information to better direct so that we can focus and prioritise our next steps.
Because we do know that neonicotinoids have been picked up in the New Zealand environment, and
Yeah.
they've been picked up in New Zealand honeys, but we don't know how much has been used and where the worst
No.
or highest intensity of use is in the country. So we just don't, that
Yeah.
data's just not available to us.
And I
But
remember, you know, way back in 2013, it came out that chlorpyrifos was found in 85% of South Island streams. Yeah, so, yeah, I guess it's just what the adverse effects of that might be. So, yeah, so I guess I think all of these recommendations you've got are good. I'd just be concerned if something that has high potential for harm got left out simply because it was part of an exemption regulation, for instance. So I would just like you to look at those kinds of things too.
Yes, it's a good point.
Anyway, any other comments? Michelle, could you turn off your one? Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, I'd be really happy to move these.
Yes.
It's so important, this work, and it's just, I die a little bit inside reading the report about how there's somebody who's meant to be in charge of this and they're either not resourced or not doing it.
No register even.
Yeah, of even the basics. So I can see how long it might take to get on top of this issue. But with all the research I do in the climate space, obviously I go down the route of ecological overshoot, I go down the route of planetary boundaries in particular. That's one I'm really interested in. And so a question I had was, because I did read once, it was released in December 2020, it was a safe operating space for New Zealand Aotearoa with a planetary boundaries framework translated for New Zealand. And I'd be really keen one day to see that for the Waikato. I realise there are some difficulties perhaps, but my question is whether if we did want the new council to be exposed to like a technical report on that, whether I'd need to add something to these resolutions, or whether it could be more like a action point to consider, or what kind of the level of enthusiasm would be from staff about that. So it's kind of taking the PCE report, the safe operating space for Aotearoa, and the work that you're proposing, and just pulling that together to be more in the planetary boundaries context. Since, you know, the scientists took all the effort to talk about those specific boundaries being things that are of particular concern, and noting also the recent reports we've had on forever chemicals, which are, I would imagine, falling pretty much in the centre of that Venn diagram, just due to the fact that it'd be pretty hard to clean them up. Yeah, just a pulling together. What do you guys think?
Absolutely, there's going to be issues under
Can you share
There you
your
go.
mic there?
Let's just
Thanks.
sit together, yeah. There will absolutely be issues under climate change, and I guess this is why Jonathan and I are very happy to be speaking to you all today, because under a change in climate, there will be increasing pressure on our use of hazardous substances to make our crops viable and provide food for our communities. So what we need to know is how we're changing that so that our actions as an organisation in terms of state and trend can pick up on that and check that that is not having an irreversible impact that we can't then remediate.
I think I need to add anything to the resolutions. Do you want that?
Oh, Brent has a suggestion.
Yeah.
We might just need a. Thank you.
I'm just wondering, team, if at the end of recommendation 4, where it's got a full stop, if there was a comma, and I think what Councillor Nicholl is saying is within a planetary boundaries context. Is that so that it's essentially ensuring that that planetary boundary context that the council is interested in is upfront in terms of yeah.
So it's additional
to how would that work for you, team?
Yeah, no, I think that's, I mean, it's good to, we need to be making the connections between different, so yeah, definitely.
Maybe, Jess, if get those forward from then to put in the, is that it's at the end of
We've got
recommendation
number
4.
4.
So
We've
if you
not
go
got
to
a number
recommendation
4.
4, go down to the.
It's just the last one.
Yeah, so
Oh, yeah.
at the bottom
Yeah.
of at the bottom of.
Yeah, it's.
Number 3.
All
okay.
right. Yes, of course. Yep.
So if you just put a comma and in a
planetary. Yep. Okay. We just have Stu. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, look, thank you. It's a bit depressing, I've got to say.
Yeah, it really is.
In saying that, I think we should never ever be afraid of collecting information and understanding what's going on. So really supportive. And it kind of strikes me, you know, I was just thinking of coated seed, and it wouldn't be that hard. I mean, there's probably only a dozen retailers of that stuff to find out how much is going into a particular catchment or subcatchment, and then doing some monitoring to see if it's having an impact. And it seems a bit silly that we're not, given what you've just told me. So really supportive of this the scoping, investigation of scoping and how we do it, because to me, how we monitor and manage impacts going forward is the challenging one, and I'm a little bit nervous, I suppose, if I'm honest, about number 2, just in the sense that we've seen through our freshwater work that the government aren't always the best organisation to be putting regulations in front of us, and the process, although I suppose our process is hardly straightforward as well. But look, at the end of the day, I think I agree with that approach, because it's just too hard to do at a regional level in terms of number 2. But so look, I'm supportive, and I guess the challenge is what we turn that results of that scoping study into. You know, the other comment I'd make, if I could, Kathy, respectfully, or Madam Chair, is I think what we've just heard in this presentation is that we often tend to get caught up in becoming quite concerned about some of those well-known contaminants or chemicals, whatever you want to call them, pesticides such as 1080. But there's probably a whole bunch of other stuff going on that we were not even aware of, and nicotinoids are a really good example.
I
you know,
agree.
and so I would just caution that politically we've got a responsibility to be to present good, sound information without a political bias, to make sure that the community are getting good information, and ensuring that if we are going to put whatever regulations we or central government put in place are there for the right reasons. You know, because I mean, look, my wife's an amateur beekeeper, and I've been doing a bit more work lately because I've got a farm that's covered in gorse and blackberry, and I use a lot of chemical to keep that under control, obviously. And now my wife's got bees. I'm taking quite a different approach to how I apply that stuff for obvious reasons, you know. And the reality is that a lot of landowners go and buy these chemicals from their farm supply store to do what they think is the right thing, because that's what people tell them to do, and we're all guilty of blissfully of chucking them around with really no idea what the long-term consequences are through no fault of our own most of the time, you know. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I just had one other comment, and that was just so that number 2, where it's talking about advocating for the recommendations to be taken up at central government level, council to do that. So will we be writing a submission, or do we need to write a letter? So
we have been in communication with Dr. Nick Kim, who's had a role in this report, and his real concern is that it will languish. He doesn't want,
that's
and he
what
doesn't,
concerns
and so
me
I
too.
know that he's keen to see it pushed. So, and I know he's got, you know, some good colleagues and friends who would probably help push that, and I think we would. It's one avenue we can look at, I suppose. But we could write something official. It would
be good if you could put some thought to that as to what would be most useful, because sometimes, you know, political advocacy is useful. Sometimes, you know, getting a letter from council.
Advocacy through the science community himself, through that he represents, I think would be
that would
really
be
good.
Really good. Fred.
Yeah, it's depressing, but there's a lot of depressing things when you start looking. And, you know, another thing that isn't being looked at is bacterium and viruses that are building up around at the exits of stormwater and sewage discharges into the natural environment. Again, citizen science that I've been involved with Staphylococcus aureus. You know, even in my lifetime, it didn't exist in a open environment for a matter of days. Now it's living for months in estuary sand, you know, causes all sorts of horrific diseases, even when you get a sandfly bite. You know, these things are being modified. Their resistances are becoming stronger due to the pharmaceuticals we're flushing down our sewer plants. Hormones, you know, all of these things that are being built up. And I'm looking at the sewage system that's proposed for Raglan, and they want to do it land-based. They think it's a marvellous thing, except no one's doing any science about all the stuff that's flushed down the loo that will build up in concentration in a particular area that's in the head of an estuary that flows through the middle of town where everybody recreates. And that, just what you've just said, through water care, says you've got to make sure that regional council act responsibly when it comes to consenting, that these things are taken into account. Because at the moment, there's nothing stopping us doing this. But thank you for raising those questions, you know, as citizen science, as what you put forward, because we're not monitoring it. No one's monitoring Staph aureus and how that is becoming rampant within our environments around. You know, just again proving this, we used more citizen science and tracked the plume of where the effluent is discharging into the harbour and where it goes. And we monitored inside the plume, outside the plume, and we could actually find by the colonies of Staph aureus, it matched where the plume ended up and where it was most concentrated in Kaitoki Bay, Raglan, right behind the school, is where the plume ended up, is where we found this stuff. And it actually survives for months. You know, so this work, it's protecting us from all sorts of things. So yeah, thank you, and I'm happy to second, definitely.
You're happy to second? I'd quite like to second, Fred. That's all right, I'll let you.
Add one more.
What's that?
Add one more.
Okay, one more thing. Can we make it quick because we're quite behind? Yep.
Huge fan of the push either through the regional sector or LGNZ. I understand they've got a chief science advisor now in LGNZ,
Yes,
so
yeah,
it's very cool. Maybe he can do stuff.
that could be.
Wherever we can provide guidance, because I'm mindful we do have guidance on sediment control, we have guidance on pest plants, etc. We being a credible source, but just articulating that yes, there's uncertainty, but how some of these categories of chemicals are used. I just think that's another space where our educational team perhaps could work to put out more information, or other parts of the organisation. There's so many parts to our organisation, but yeah, I'd be a real big fan of that, because just the lack of EPA or central government not being in the space doesn't mean that our local community can't have some more guidance from organisation like us that is credible and not industry or not any of these other things. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks very much. There's obviously quite a lot of support for this, and I'm really grateful to you for coming along with such great recommendations too. Yeah, so all in favour? Actually, perhaps we should just move the recommendation onto the screen because we've changed it. Can we just move it up a little bit as well so that we can see it all? And okay, so all in favour? Aye. Any against? No, that's carried. Thank you very much, Jonathan and Michelle.
Thank
Really
you.
appreciate it. Okay, Mike.
Thank you for having
Mike,
us.
thank you very much. Yeah. And thank you very much for all of your hard work through this triennium. Really appreciate it. Okay, we're up to, this is groundwater nitrates, hotspots, legacy and lags.
Hot seat.
And this is on page 17.
Kia ora koutou, councillors.
Welcome, Mike.
Thank you very much for the invitation to come and talk about groundwater nitrates. Madam Chair, I just highlight, just this morning I'd got an email from Dr. Chris Dorney, who is our Chief Science Advisor for the regional sector, and in that update he included a link to a report from the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor in relation to nitrates in drinking water. So with your permission, I'll put that link into the chat.
Yes, please. That would be great.
I know we, oops. I know we'd promised to keep you up to date with the latest work. So this was a review done within the office of the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor and reviewed by, I think, 20 different scientists around the country. So hopefully that'll be of interest. So today's talk really stems from a focus on nitrate and groundwater across our region and comes from analysis that John Hadfield and others have done as part of our comprehensive State of the Environment report. So that's a project, big project that Thomas is leading, and I think both John Hadfield and Thomas Wilder are on the line as well. So I'll just provide a brief summary, knowing that you'll have no doubt read the report, and so I'll quickly go through that. So Dave, if I could have the next slide, please. Just to highlight issues around nitrate contamination of the environment are a growing concern for elements of the community, and obviously this committee, we've talked about issues around nitrate contamination before, and no doubt we'll continue to talk about them. Next slide, please. Just wanted to highlight the extensive monitoring networks that we do have across the region, and these are for both State of the Environment monitoring, where we've got 110 wells monitored, and that's been since the mid to late 90s, which Ed mentioned earlier on, and then also a community network, which is more related to community supply wells, and that's associated with rural schools. The reason being that it was hoped that when they were set up that rural schools would be quite stable long term. obviously there's been quite a bit of change in the rural community, and some of those schools perhaps weren't as stable as we thought. But that network has been going since 2000 and focuses primarily on the use for drinking water, whereas the wider SOE network, those wells are to represent the wider regional patterns. Just to highlight that there's a wide array of parameters looked at, but here we've just been asked to look at nitrate levels. And obviously the State of the Environment report will cover all of the different things we look at. Just to highlight too, that we will be initiating a review of the network to look at its representativeness and coverage, and whether there's some changing issues that we need to look at. So we'll kick that off this year. But depending on how substantial the changes might be, that might take a little bit of time to implement. Next slide, please. These two slides really highlight with some different coloured dots where we see greatest levels of groundwater nitrate, and you'll see that the levels there, so the dark blue is levels below 1 milligram per litre, and then the green 1 milligram per litre to 5.65, orange 5.65 to 11.3, and red greater than 11.3. And so that 11.3 is the drinking water standard, so the maximum allowable value for drinking water set within New Zealand and also internationally at the moment. Sorry. And internationally, yeah, through the World Health Organization. So just to highlight where we see highest levels, so those areas of red, there is some concentration of those areas, particularly where we see intensive horticulture and dairying. So parts of the northern part of the region around Pukekohe and Pukekohe, and also over in the Hauraki Plains, Hamilton Basin as well, some reasonably high levels. The one red dot down in Taupo, my understanding was more associated with a sort of a particular location, some sheep yards. Next slide, please. So this next slide really looks at trends over time, and when we look at the regional network, so you can see the increasing trends is the red triangles and the decreasing trends are the blue triangles. There's a mix of increasing and decreasing, about 30% for each. In the regional network, community network shows a higher percentage, about a quarter of those sites degrading and only 6% improving. It is really difficult, and this is something that actually Chris Dorney, who's our Chief Science Advisor for the regional sector, has done a lot of work in this space, but linking trends in groundwater to the causes can be really difficult. But we think on balance it's likely that land use intensification and the intensification that's occurred over the last 20 years within the Waikato region will be a key factor in that, in those increasing trends. Next slide. This is information we publish regularly on our website. So this is compliance information around our current drinking water standards. Around 12% of the regional wells exceed drinking water standards, and a further 20% are at that half of the maximum allowable value. The community wells is much lower percentage of exceedances there, and those that have exceeded are no longer used for potable water. So that information we've been able to give around the exceedances has seen some changes in the use of those. The the report mentions, and we've raised previously with EPC, the committee around a Danish study looking at the risks of colorectal cancer and nitrating groundwater. That study indicated that there was a greater risk when levels were beyond 0.87 milligrams per litre. That's in reference to our national and international standards around 11. So it's, you know, an order of magnitude lower. And so if we were to look at a much lower standard, then a significant proportion of our regional groundwater wells and those community supply wells would breach that. The final slide, I think, Dave, please. Oh, sorry, one more after this. I just, if we just go back to the other one, I just wanted to highlight some recent research here. So no doubt those of the councillors who've been involved in Plan Change 1 would have heard a lot about nitrogen lags, or Taupo variation, for example, would have heard a lot about nitrogen lags, load to come. Research that we've been co-funding alongside an MB program has really challenged our thinking about those time lags. So the figure on the right there really shows that shallow groundwater, so SGW, is a major source of the nitrogen load that we see in our freshwater. So it's based on some complex modelling work that's been done to understand where the nitrogen comes from. For deeper groundwater, that's the DGW, which is in the green there. There's very few waterways that are dominated by that deeper groundwater, but including places like the Upper Waihao, for example. Every surface water every stream is a mixture of those different sources, whether it be shallow groundwater or deeper groundwater or near surface, including overland flow. But we're seeing a much stronger signal now around that shallow groundwater and near surface. And that means that our rivers are responding more quickly to changes in land management and land use than we previously thought. It also means that if we put in place policies to change things, we should see the benefits more quickly than we had thought previously. I just thought that was a valuable thing to throw into the mix here. And then the final slide is just some conclusions, which really just, I guess, cover off again the key points that we've already talked about. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Yeah, really good summary. Have we got any questions? Jen?
I was just going to say thank you. To have a positive message coming through after the last paper just really lifts the spirits.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
No, but I'll just leave my question until someone else has had a turn. Dennis, you can imagine. Yes.
So, yeah, is Dennis?
Yes,
He
thanks,
has got
Chair.
his hand up. Sorry, Dennis, you go first.
Well, it's just a question. I've got some comments maybe later, but Mike, I'm just wondering where the responsibility lies. I know that, we obviously test groundwater, but I suppose for consumers, what really counts is the levels of concentrations of contaminants, including nitrate, in their tap water. And so I'm wondering where the responsibility lies at that level of testing. Does it lie with the health department, or does it lie potentially with us now under new law? Or so can you just clarify that for me? Thanks.
I think I'll just make mention that the monitoring data that we gather in those networks, those networks from across the region, are provided to the landowners. So that's information that we're collecting on the behalf of the region, but we provide that information to them.
Right.
I think it's a really important question, and that you raise about where the responsibilities lie. So with Taumata Arawai now ramping up its activities in the drinking water space, we have requirements under the Water Services Bill to provide them with information. And I think it's almost, in my view, almost certain that they will be coming to us, i.e. the regional sector, for more information in future and more detailed information, not just around assistance with mapping of source water protection zones, but also the water quality information that they'll use to base some of their information on. So, yeah, I think we're in a bit of a state of flux at the moment, and yeah, we're probably going to need to put more emphasis on how we support Taumata Arawai to achieve their outcomes of improving drinking water quality.
Right. So given that you're saying there's a state of flux at the moment, is it your sort of anticipation that sometime in the near term regional councils might be asked to monitor actual drinking water out of the tap?
Mike, if I can just grab that one, councillor. So the short answer to that question is no, it's quite definitely not a regional council function. It's quite definitely a responsibility of Taumata Arawai. And one of the things through the Water Services Act is placing quite a lot of new obligations on parties that are called water suppliers. And so you would have seen in the legislation that goes down to anybody supplying water to more than one party, one household. And so that's created quite a lot of water suppliers, in addition to what we might think of as traditional water suppliers being the territorial authorities. So Taumata Arawai has got a program of work to work with all of those water suppliers to ensure that they're meeting their obligations about the provision of water. What Mike has quite rightfully noted is that the legislation requires regional authorities to work with Taumata Arawai around the provision of information that would support water suppliers to achieve their obligations around producing what they call water safety plans effectively. There's another technical word for them, but that's effectively what they are. And so, as you will have heard through from Mike previously and through the policy team, the work, and John Hadford, who's online, he might have some comments about this as well, the work that this council is doing around information gathering around source water to be able to support those that then take that source water to turn it into drinking water, to enable them to put in the best safety plan that they can. And I know this has been a passionate area of work for John for the last decade or two. And so the work has started, but I know that John knows that there's quite a lot more that we want to do, but we're definitely not in the drinking water end of that. We're at the source water end of that. John, is there anything that you might want to add to that?
So Brent, if I could just clarify what you're saying, thanks.
I think the term you're looking for was source water risk management plans.
Yep.
So Brent, just to clarify, so under this new regime, who would actually have the responsibility to monitor the actual drinking water coming out of the tap? Would that be with suppliers, or is it some other regulatory body? I mean, how do you see that panning out?
So the regulatory body is Taumata Arawai. So in days gone by, that would have been the Department of Health, but the new legislation clearly puts the onus on the drinking water provider to demonstrate that they're meeting those standards, and the regulator is Taumata Arawai, in a similar way that we would place the obligations on a wastewater discharge, and we would be the regulator to make sure that they comply. In the drinking water space, Taumata Arawai set the standards, and then they are the regulator. But as Mike mentioned, we are a critical part of information provision to enable water suppliers to prepare the plans that John just described the word for, which I summarised down to water safety plans.
Yeah, right. Okay. Is this the time for comment now, Chair, or should we see if there are any more questions?
Yeah, I think nobody actually has a light on. So, yeah, so we don't need to have any more comment or questions.
Right. Well, I've put in the chat, and it's really quite revealing that Mike's referred to this latest chief advisor to the Prime Minister, because I stumbled on that in the last couple of days when I was looking into that, and I really do recommend that report because it's a very excellent summary of the latest sort of thinking on this issue. And so one of the things I think that was mentioned in that report that maybe is missing from our one is, apart from a risk relating to cancer, there's now an emerging risk relating to low weight and preterm births as well. So there's both those health issues, such that even, as I understand it, the Midwives Association is taking a precautionary approach and recommending to pregnant women that they consider a level of 5 milligrams a litre, and if it's in excess of that, that they use drinking water or some treatment option. And the Health Research Council has been granted a fund of nearly $2 million to do further search. And it's interesting that the two lead authors are Tim Chambers, an epidemiologist who's been raising these concerns, but also Chris Dowie, who you've just mentioned as advising the regional sector. So all that sort of going on. But what that, I mean, obviously there's some real concerns here, given even at the current level, the World Health Organization level, something around 12% of wells exceed that. And as Mike pointed out, if that rate was to be lowered to the level in the Danish study, then 3/4 of the wells are an issue. So there's obviously a real concern here. And that got me thinking, what are the implications? And Brent has just outlined, what those are. And as I understand it, we would have to provide assistance to water suppliers on potential or actual or potential contamination of drinking water sources. And we also have an obligation to provide data to Te Mata Arawai. And then given Mike's report, which I think the most thing that leapt out me at the most about it was this new understanding that it's not so much deep groundwater, but shallow and surface water that is potentially the problem, and his comment that policy interventions may then work more quickly. So putting all that together, I thought maybe the way forward is to make sure that we are on top of these new obligations, and a review similar to the one we've just passed relating to the PCE report might be appropriate. So I ran that idea past Tracy, and she is warm to that idea, that it would be quite a good idea that we as a committee recommended that sort of review take place. So that's where I've sort of landed with it. I haven't heard back from Tracy to my draft wording, but Brent may have some comments around it. But I put it up in the chat. Maybe that could be copied and pasted onto the screen. But
so it is on the screen at the moment.
Oh, great. Okay. So yeah, basically it's just saying that we follow that PCE example and suggest that strategy and policy conduct a review into these obligations, and on the policy effectiveness, particularly relating to Mike's commentary that there's now a new understanding around where the real problem is, and what policy interventions might actually help us in this area.
Yeah.
And that's not just for nitrates, but all manner of contaminants, of course.
So,
Yeah,
so thank you for that, Councillor. Yes, Tracy has looked at this, and I know that John Hadfield has looked at this as well. And effectively, what you've got here is a reinforcement of a work program that's important to our science and policy part of the business. And so I think this recommendation would be supported by staff.
That's right. So I'd actually just like to move this. Unless you want to move it, Dennis?
I'm happy to second it.
Okay. Okay, all in favour?
Aye.
Aye. Any against? Carried. Thanks very much, Mike. Really appreciate that. Okay, we are moving on. We're going to be looking at consent statistics. This is on page 25. Are you going to be delivering this report? Amy's not, we did expect Amy, but Amy has actually got something else she has to attend.
So yes, as I mentioned earlier, Amy's attending Joe's funeral, which is on about now. So if I could just take this report as read, councillors, it's pretty much that update so that you can see the significant things that are happening within the region. If there's any particular questions about any of these matters, I will answer what I can. What I can't answer, I will ensure an answer gets to you. In brief, you'll see the team continue to meet their timeframe compliance requirements, and there's a lot of big projects on.
I just had one question on what is a new protein plant? Page 26, Waikato Industrial Estate. Do you know what it means by operation of a new protein plant? Is that one of the alternative protein plants or? Sorry, this is the one which is significant applications in progress. It's the third one down on page 26. Waikato Industrial Estate Limited, discharges associated with the operation of a new protein plant. I just wondered what that meant. It's Waharoa, I thought it would be.
This is the site that you all have known as the old Wallace Corp site.
Right.
That site is in a joint partnership now with Greenly Meats in Town, another entity, and they're doing an upgrade, which is good. And as part of that upgrade, there are new consenting requirements.
Okay, that was the only question I had. Does anyone have any other questions?
Yes, I did, thanks. Just looking at the Buffalo Beach homeowner seawall consent, it refers to an additional consent required by the District Council. Could you perhaps explain what that additional consent relates to? Thanks.
I'm not 100% sure of that detail, Councillor. I will find that out for you. This obviously went through its hearing process, and I'm presuming during the course of that hearing process, they've identified that there was a supplementary consent that hadn't been sought from the district.
Right.
My suspicion is it's got something to do with the line of mean high water springs and where things wander in and out of the jurisdiction of the region and the district, but I will get that answer and forward it through to you, Councillor. Other councillors interested in that answer as well, or just for Councillor Teague?
Yep.
Okay, I'll find that out and I'll get that back to you.
Thanks, Brent.
Thank you. Okay, if there are no other,
Yep.
Oh, sorry, Fred, yes.
Yeah, the wastewater plant. It's Raglan upgrade to wastewater plant. It says it's on hold until further consultation with community. I think it said, where is it? Application on hold whilst WDC engages further with community. This has been going on for what, 4 years, 5 years? Consultation with the community, and you're never, I guess the question is, when do you step in to say there's been adequate consultation, or is this just going to go on forever?
So
you'll never get a consensus in Raglan.
So I can get you some more details about that as well, Councillor. My understanding is that the proposal as originally presented was predominantly a discharge into the harbour, and through their consultation with the community, there was a desire to see options around a land-based disposal.
No, sir. Some suggest that.
Yes, and so through that process, there was suggestions about has that alternative being looked at, in particular with not, for example, a summer discharge alternative. And so the District Council has then gone out to look at that as an option to then consult with its community about, and you're dead right, it's at the point now where this option has been considered, and the next step is what's on the table so it can go through the decision-making process. So if you like, the on-hold period was to give the District Council the opportunity to investigate an alternative option that some parts of the community are interested in pursuing. But you're right, once you've had a look at the options, the next thing is get on and get a decision. So that's the next step in this process.
Yeah, I was looking at that process. It looks to me that it's A long way away as far as, yeah, any community consensus goes. And, you know, now a developer's stepped in and saying, well, hey, if you build us a road, WDC, and you do this, you do that, then you can have this land for cheap and you can put it here. To me, it's not really, you know, an acceptable process where deals are being done with WDC that might consider a whole lot of new rateable properties a viable option to pursue in the interests of their rate take at the expense of a good environmental outcome. And I want council, you know, how council will weigh that up, where I'm very aware where you get consultants, again, that will work very well for their client and tick all the boxes, yet the outcome is way less than, and we've seen this council accept some of these science reports as saying, well, this is all being ticked off by the appropriate qualified person, and hello, we've got disasters down the track. So I have real concerns with this Raglan plant in two aspects. The cost, the environmental outcome could be less than desirable. Again, it was, you know, if you get into a technical part, the hormones, etc., that's going to be discharged and concentrated on land and ahead of an estuary, and bacterial loads, etc., that go through the soil that end up coming out on springs all around the foreshore, that go through one of our heaviest seafood collected areas and recreational areas as being acceptable by some. And the science report saying, oh yes, dilution through rainfall is going to be part of that solution, where currently it discharges after really well treated effluent into the Tasman Sea, and you can't get better dilution. Rainfall in an area on it just doesn't cut it. So I've looked at all the various ways, and yes, tangata whenua are adamant it has to go through the land, and the weighting the council gives through treaty agreements, etc., to tangata whenua's desires that may not necessarily be the best environmental outcome, no offence, but sometimes the science, humans are human and they make mistakes, and not always beliefs meet up with a perfect outcome. You know, hormones, pharmaceuticals, all of these things that we now discharge into a waste system historically never happened. So the way things we used to do and way things we do now, applying that historic approach may not be the best. So I'm concerned again about making sure, because again, the community can't reach a consensus. The district council just might go for the best economic outcome rather than the best environmental outcome. So
if I could just make the comment that it's very important that we never enter into a process with any predetermined position, either at staff or at the political level. So I think what is being described here is the applicant has been taking time to look at options and alternatives that will go through the formal process, and all of the matters that you've described, Councillor, no doubt will come about through that process. So an appropriate decision can be made considering all the information. So I take the point though about how long do you wait before getting into a decision-making process? Understand that's the next step in this, now that the community has had its opportunity to have its say.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to move that we receive this report. Can I have a seconder, please? Yes, that's great. What's that? Oh, sorry, Dennis.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Sorry, I scrolled down and noted I've got another couple of questions. The Waihi North project, Brent, I imagine that runs to many hundreds of pages. What is the opportunity for additional cost recovery for a really big application like that? Is there any room for that? Because I imagine this is going to take up a lot of resource within the staff.
This will be fully cost recovered, Councillor.
Right.
All of our costs will be covered by the applicant as part of this consent process.
Right, thank you. The second one was relating to the Tiaraha solar farm project, which is going through a fast track process. And I see the comment, the EPA has asked for some commentary from us by mid-August. We sort of looked at renewable energy quite closely in the Climate Action Committee recently, and pretty keen on enhancing and boosting renewable energy opportunities in the region. So I'm just wondering, can you confirm we will be supportive of that project?
So, Councillor, when they ask us for comments, they ask us for comments in relation to the specific applications that would otherwise have been before us. And so, in that regard, for something like this, the applications come to the Regional Council for some associated earthworks, because most of the issues are around the land use consent to be able to put in the solar farm. And so where it talks about invited to comment, it's not invited to comment in the sense of our policy views about the district council's consents. It's about the consent applications that would otherwise have been lodged with us, which, like I say, are earthworks, which is why this is being handled by Connie, who is one of our earthworks advisors. So we're a bit of a minor player in these ones, Councillor.
Just a follow-up question. So, I mean, if our regional policy statement or other policies are supportive of renewable energy, would that be something that we would be mentioning in our report to the EPA?
Oh.
So that in the fast track process, they're quite specific about the questions that they ask us. I would expect that the questions that they're asking of the district council as it relates to the district planning matters, because they also are required to give effect to the regional policy statement. So the regional policy statement direction as it relates to renewable energy will without doubt come into this process, most likely presented by the applicant, because as you note, the policy framework is supportive of renewable electricity.
Okay. We do have a couple more lights on here. Just want to point out that we need to finish here today at 1 o'clock. There's something happening in here this afternoon. So if anyone does have a question or a comment, can you please make it brief? Thanks. Okay, so we've got Fred first.
Yep, two things. The Aotea Harbour, the SPAC collection is being held up by one submitter. Again, I'm just wanting, the support in progressing aquaculture, marine farming. Is this, how long is that likely to take? Who's the judge in the process? Brent, there seems to be, again, stalled out and going nowhere.
That's all right.
So I'll find out the details for you, Councillor. Often what happens in these situations where there's one party, the next step is to go to a hearing, which involves quite a bit of costs to the applicant. So often an applicant will say to us, can you just put that to the side for the minute while they work with this party so that they can find a resolution which is mutually satisfying, which means that the applicant doesn't then have to pick up the cost of a hearing. If they then find that they can't get that mutual satisfaction, then we say, okay, let's set up a hearing for a decision to be made. So I can get the detail, but that's typically what happens when you've just got one submitted. They often figure they can work it out outside.
Okay, thank you. And the other one was the fish farm in Dennis's patch. The public, it's not till 2023, but I'm particularly interested in that because it is going to be quite a trendsetter in this area. Is what involvement, or if any, where's it being held? Can a politician turn up? That's it.
So, like anything, it's not a political forum. It'll be people who submit and present evidence. You'll not be surprised to know that we have quite a large team of experts giving us advice around this matter. All that evidence will end up coming before a hearings panel, and decisions will be made. As the report notes, they're not anticipating hearings until 2023 because right now lots of issues are being worked through with parties.
So there's not like a court, there's not somewhere you can just sit and listen.
Well, in due course, when the hearing does get scheduled, I can make sure that we give an update of the timing of that hearing if somebody's interested in going and listen.
That would be really good. Yeah, because I think it is something of which is a lot of interest. Yes. Okay.
It was just
Okay, Councillor Nicol.
Yep, it was just around the Te Awa Lakes one. As I drive past, I see that they're busy with their diggers moving stuff around, but I saw that the application on hold, but it said stage 1. I was just wondering, are they doing work, but they don't yet need this consent, obviously? Or just, if you're not aware, that's all right. Just carry out.
Not aware, can find out for you. Often there are works that can be done in preparation under the permitted activity rules in the plan.
Yeah, gotcha.
They're not the sort of entity that I'm aware would do things without resource consent in place.
No, exactly.
But I can actually get the team to give you an update if you like.
Yeah, that'd be
about
cool.
current activity at the
Just
time.
because it said stage 1, I thought, oh, why not ask?
We'll note
Thank
that down.
Okay. Now, Councillor Tegg, you need to make this very fast, this one. Okay? We need to move on to the territorial authorities. The update
Sorry,
on
I'm all good, thanks.
territorial
I'll lower my
authorities.
hand, thanks.
Oh, you have? Oh, thanks very much, Dennis. Okay, so I'd like to move that we receive the report on the consent statistics. Stu seconds, all in favour? Aye. Any against? Carried. Cool. Okay, so moving on to the next one. Now, I think Brent is giving us an update on this as well. This is page 31, update on Territorial Authorities 3 Waters compliance. I think we should take this as read and just because it's a really good summary. It kind of looks at it overall how we're doing, but just then focuses on the ones which that we still have some issues with. So, yeah, Brent.
Yeah, I agree. Let's take in the report as read. Just acknowledge that the support that the committee has provided by putting a little bit of focus in this area, that focus is being reflected by, when we look at it in its totality, the step forward in this space, you'll see that there's the odd area where there's still a little bit of work to be done, but if we look at it as a trend, the trend is definitely in the right direction in relation to that the work they're doing in this space. So if there's no specific questions, it's a good example of management and governance working together to put some focus on an issue.
Yeah, I'll
Okay.
second that. Just really appreciative of the work
Yeah.
on the focus of this for most of the trinium and the fact that it's going in the right direction. Much appreciated.
Did you want to move it or second it? Move it.
Second.
Fred will second. That's great. Any
Just
other
comment,
comments,
is this
Fred?
the last item?
It is apart from the matters arising, yes, but I don't think there'll be much.
Okay,
in that.
I'd just like to point out that, these wastewater plants that are discharging into rivers, and yet there's so much emphasis again in Raglan to put it on land where we happen to be right beside the Tasman Sea. And I just, again, think that if it shouldn't be acceptable putting it into a river where we then take drinking water out of, but again, concentrating the unpredictable, all of these chemicals that aren't monitored onto a piece of land is not an acceptable option either. Just point in case.
Yeah. Any other comments? No? I guess my only comment, and I mean, I think it is good that we're moving in the right overall direction, but it does still concern me that I read things like there remains a number of matters that DC needs to address to ensure full compliance for consents. And yeah, I mean, there are still some ones in there which are quite significant, I think, for so just to point out that although we are moving in the right direction, it's really good to also have the detail, the focus on the things that still aren't right. So yeah, I'd really like to thank everybody for the work that they've done on a regular basis on this, just to keep us informed. Yeah.
In the lead up for the new council,
Yes.
well, whatever form this committee takes, it might be worth considering how keeping this agenda item in the run up to the transitions of the
Yeah.
through Water's work, etc.
I think it's pretty important also that we share the information that we have gleaned from this committee, just to actually show how much progress can be made as well. So anyway,
Awesome.
okay, so we moved it and seconded it, but we didn't actually vote on it, did we? We didn't? Let's vote. Okay, so let's put it. All in favour?
Aye.
Aye. Any against? No, carried. Thank you. Okay, yes, matters arising from previous meetings minutes. Is there anything in there that anyone wants to actually comment on or raise? This is the one on page 36. It's really good, I think, that we've got this to keep track of all of the things that we've raised so that we don't actually, we don't lose focus on them, because it's quite easy as you move to new topics to actually forget what you've talked about before. Is there anything in there that anyone wants to comment on?
I've got a quick one, thanks, Chair.
Still brief one.
Yes, councillor Teague.
There's the reference to the McGregor Bay situation, Brent. Just a little update. I mean, are the flat gates, do they remain open? As reference to a sort of state of limbo there. I mean, is that going to continue indefinitely? I mean, when do we get a resolution? Are we waiting on District Council to make an application, or how do we finally resolve this and sort of tick it off?
So the status is as it was last time, Dennis. There are no flat gates there because the District Council knows that it needs to apply for resource consent if it wants to reinstate them, and we haven't received any resource consent application, and so there are no gates.
Right. I suppose it's just a question of how long this state of limbo. I mean, can this just go on indefinitely where we're not sure they're going to make an application, or, you know, is it going to be finally resolved somehow?
So I have not heard anything from the at the end of the day, I suppose it'll be with not members of that local community convince the District Council to lodge an application. I'm not hearing the District Council coming forward with an application. I haven't heard any murmurings around it. So like I say, until they get some direction from their community to request, status quo, there's no gates.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank
Fred,
you.
Second.
You want to second it? Yes, that's fine. Councillor Litchfark seconding. Did you have a comment to make as well?
This is the final?
This is the final, yes.
And before you close the meeting,
Yes.
I'd like to show my appreciation to the chair and all the work that you have done for this committee and for our region, and really appreciate it. You've done a marvellous job, Kathy, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Fred. That's lovely.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is.
Thank you.
Really appreciated this committee. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think
Covered
you've been
some
a
great
great
ground.
committee, really great committee. So thank you to everybody. Thank you, Brent. And thank you to the Democracy Services people too. Really appreciate it. Okay, and we've got a closing karakia from Brent.
And so before I do so, personally, Kathy, thank you.
Thank you.
Been a wonderful chair to work with.
That's great. And you've been great
Wonderful.
to work with too.
And
Thanks,
you've
Brent.
been a fantastic committee. It's, I think, to be fair, sometimes the collegial nature that occurs in this committee between councillors and staff may not always be evident, but I do know, as Patrick mentioned earlier, how appreciative all of the staff that report through this committee do find that it's a nice place to come, and it's a nice place to share their work, and it's an environment that you will help create under your leadership, Kathy. So
Yeah, I think I've liked the way we all discuss things here, and that it feels like it's an open opportunity to raise things that sometimes might be difficult. So yeah, thank you.
Ko mutu a matoa mahi mo tēnei wā. Our work has finished for the moment. Manakitia mai matu katoa. Bless us all. Matou hoa, matou whānau. Our colleagues, our families. Iho i te aurangi. Peace.
That's a lovely way to end. Thank you. Yeah, fabulous. Go for it. There you go. Why not? Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ayla.